Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Science of Kabbalah with your hosts, Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Science of Kabbalah here on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. This is Rabbi Yitzhak.
And this is William Hall. How are you doing, brother?
I'm doing pretty good. It's been an amazing time. We're just coming out of Pesach. We're in the midst of the counting of the Omer, which is always a great time spiritually to come out of this time of redemption and then spend this time now working on ourselves, elevating ourselves now from those 49 gates of impurity that we talk about, and now counting the 49 days of the Omer, trying to attain the same spiritual level that we had on the Seder night, on Passover, when we had such an incredible ability to connect with the upper light. How about you?
Absolutely. It was really awesome. We had the opportunity to spend Pesach with my oldest daughter and her son, and they live with us, but they've been kind of like distant from that. And this year we all sat at the table together and shared some cool stories, and that definitely wasn't your typical Seder, but it was very meaningful, and we all really connected well. It was really a great time for sure.
Good. I'm glad that you had that experience, and you and I have had kind of like a little interesting time over the last several weeks, a little bit of disconnect. So it's good to be back together.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel the same way for sure.
Yeah. So I'm excited about today because, we like to have guests on the show, and we have a special guest today. Looking forward to talking to him. He has a very interesting story, a very interesting background, and I know that our listeners usually like to hear people's stories and people's journeys in Judaism, and so we certainly have somebody like that today. It's interesting because I always find it interesting when people grow up with different backgrounds. I mean, you and I have completely different backgrounds. Me being a Jew from Brooklyn, growing up in the Orthodox community, going off the derech for many years, coming back and making tshuva and becoming a balei tshuva and working myself back up. You coming from a, very Christian background, also both of us very poor. I don't know that that's necessarily true of our guest, but we'll hear from him shortly. So,
yes, indeed.
It's just an incredible time. So, again, I'm really excited about today. I'm also excited about this time, about the counting of the Omer. I'm excited about how special Pesach was, and you're not going to want to miss this show. So stay with us. We're going to be back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
How did a nice Jewish girl from Delaware end up living in Israel? Shalom, I'm Natalie Sapinski. Join me on my show, Returning Home. Meet different people who have moved to Israel. Hear their personal stories, their highs, their lows, and everything in between. Each week, we talk to experts on immigration and the process of moving to Israel. Listen to Returning Home every Thursday, only on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
We're back here on the Science of Kabbalah, and as I mentioned, William, before the break, we have a very special guest with us today. His name is Mordechai ben Avraham, but he did not grow up with that name. He has a very interesting story, having been born in Springfield, Ohio, but he grew up in Calabasas, California. Calabasas is near L.A., not Louisiana for you, William, Los Angeles.
Fortunately for me, I have been there once. I went to a Jewish wedding. It was pretty awesome, actually.
In Los Angeles?
Yeah.
Cool. Anyway, he went to UCLA, but ended up dropping out, and he started what seems to be a very successful internet and entertainment company, raised millions of dollars for that particular business model. He began to book tours for rap and hip-hop stars, and eventually he sold that. And he then worked in marketing and film production as an executive producer. And that was all around the age, in his 20s, by the way, up until the age of 25. He ended up selling that. And he ended up, like many people, traveling the world, exploring the world, exploring different business opportunities. He ended up visiting Israel, which had a profound effect on him, and then came home and began sort of a new spiritual journey for him. So rather than me going on and on, it's probably better for me to bring him in and welcome him to the show. Mordechai ben Avraham, welcome to the Science of Kabbalah.
Yes, welcome, my friend.
Nice to be here with you guys. It's an honor to be here. I'm very excited.
Awesome.
So are we. So whenever we have a guest, especially somebody, regardless of what their background is, really the listeners really want to hear a little bit about your story. I mean, I gave them a general idea of your bio, but maybe we know that you're a Jewish guy now that's living in the land of Israel. You live in Jerusalem. I live in Tzfat, in the holy city of Tzfat, 2 holy cities. But give us a little bit more of the backstory. What was the faith you had growing up, and what brought you?
So my parents grew up Christian. My dad's from Ohio. My mom was born in Meridian, Mississippi, which is like a small, it's like a poor town. I mean, I've been there a couple of times when we were very young to visit my grandparents, but they built churches. That's what they did. They built churches. My mom's family, my great grandfather, they built churches all throughout Mississippi, different areas, and so that was the household she grew up in. But my grandmother was actually a jazz musician, and she was a performer. She traveled around a little bit, and eventually became an educator. And then my mom's an educator; she's a professor. My sister's a professor, and on my dad's side, my grandfather was actually a war veteran. He was in the Korean War, and he was very involved in the masonry. He was in the Masons, and my dad said he became a 33-degree Mason, which I guess is a very high thing there. And he had a very open mind to life in general. He was exposed to a lot of things. And so my dad was just, went to college, was a biology type major, and eventually became a businessman. And then while they were both in college, my mom and dad, they were at that time it was the 70s, and a lot of African Americans, they were very it was a whole push of Islam that was going on college campuses. You had Muhammad Ali and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and it was just kind of this enlightenment moment spiritually for African Americans, where they were kind of rethinking Christianity and rethinking the idea of Jesus being kind of this God figure for them. And because a lot of it was connected to a lot of what they thought was racism. They felt a lot of the KKK and a lot of the racist thoughts that were in the South were fueled by the way Christianity was being taught. So them being on college campuses was kind of this enlightenment thing. So they got involved in Islam, but eventually got into what they call Sufism, which is more of a spiritual thing, because the Islam they were initially connected to was very much rooted in Black nationalism, and my parents were looking for, I think, something more, and so they got into what you call Sufism, whatever. And so that's kind of the household we grew up. My dad had an insurance company. He sold it, but he had was a very successful person. Still is a very successful person. And like I said, my mom's an educator, and so we grew up in a very just very traditional home. We grew up in the San Fernando Valley, which is the town Calabasas. We lived in West Hills. Just very upper middle class type of environments. I would say the difference between Calabasas and Beverly Hills is that they would say Beverly Hills was old money and Calabasas was new money. So most of the kids who grew up in Calabasas, their parents just made they had some booming type of a business, or it wasn't necessarily based off of inheritance. So it was, as where Beverly Hills was this person was wealthy and his grandparents were wealthy, whatever type of thing. So it was a very kind of open environment, very accepting. We had Asian kids, Jewish kids, Muslim kids, everyone just kind of, but no one really was focused on religion or these types of things. I could keep going because there's more, but
it's very interesting. What I found really interesting when you talked about the Black nationalism was actually it's the 53rd anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I was thinking about that today with the idea of having you on the show as well, which I thought was a very interesting connection, which I had not realized before until today. So when you say black nationalism, you're talking about like Malcolm X. Is that where you originally?
Like, I mean, it was a lot of it. A lot of it was like, I mean, you have to think about it. Like, I mean, African Americans' introduction in North America to religion was Christianity on a plantation.
Yes,
on a plantation,
absolutely, right.
And it was given to them under a certain context, meaning that like Jesus was kind of like compared to the slave master and their obedience, you know, to that system of being enslaved was very much connected to this obedience to God type of a thing. And so, and they weren't even allowed to read, you know, they weren't allowed to read, they weren't allowed to congregate, you know, even though religious freedoms existed in America, African Americans did not participate in these religious freedoms. And so the generations, you know, before my parents were the first generations to kind of like enter the academic system in a lot of ways. As a collective, there were individuals, there were, you know, Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass, there was great scholars that exist in the African American culture, but as collective communities going into mainstream universities and sharing that experience, you know, my parents' parents were kind of like the first generation to kind of do that. And so, you know, when they were given a religion, you know, they were kind of like given it from the standpoint of having very low self-esteem and very low self-opinions of themselves. So a lot of times when minority groups are like pushed down, you know, you see this kind of, the response to that is kind of like a superiority. I don't want to say it's a complex, but it's kind of a superiority type of thing. Well, you know, we're superior to them, you know, even though they've been telling us that we're nobody, we're actually the superior ones, you know, type of a thing. Or, you know, we're greater than what we've been told we are, and we're actually beautiful, and they told us we were ugly, and, you know, these types of things. And so these kind of like sentiments were kind of like mixed into like this kind of like exodus from Christianity. And so one part of the African American community went towards Islam, and the other part went into what we call now Hebrew Israelites. Okay. So both of those were expansions from like this kind of like, you know, for lack of a better term, Enlightenment movement that existed in the Black community in the 60s and 70s.
Right. So we only have a couple of minutes in this segment. I know William had a question.
So I've been hearing quite a lot at least for the past 5 or 6 years that I have been out of Christianity. There's a debate amongst, and the claim is that the Black Hebrew Israelites are the real Jews, and the Jews that we know today basically have usurped everything of theirs, and now they're trying to take it back. You're the only person I've ever had the opportunity to ask, and I'd just like to kind of get your spin on that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, even a lot of the Hebrew Israelites also attack African American religious Jews. You know, myself, I know Nassim Black, a very prominent singer in the Jewish communities, you know, dealt with a lot of attacks. But it's an interesting thing because it's like, you know, Judaism, Yiddishkeit, you know, keeping the Torah is a relationship with Hashem. So I don't know how someone can take that away from you. You know what I mean? I don't know how someone can take, you know, your relationship with God, the omnipresent entity, you know, away from you. So the argument itself is kind of an interesting argument from their perspective. And also, you know, no one's stopping them. Right. You know, no one's stopping, no one's stopping, just like no one's stopping me from going on my adventure to do my best for the rest of my life to keep the 613 mitzvahs. You know, like no one's stopping me from that. No one's stopping them from doing that. So you have to say that a lot of their argument is just frustration. Like I said, African Americans came into this country with a severe lack of knowledge. Like when you look at child trafficking today, right? Like this is a big concept, child trafficking. There's literally children that are being used as breeding tools, where you'll take one child, a female and a male, and they will have a child, and it'll be an undocumented child, and they would take this child and sell it and make money from it. It's a big business. So when you look at the African American experience, it was like, not, I wouldn't say just dafka child trafficking, but like just human trafficking, you know? And so when you see it from that perspective, you're saying people that came into a world that were literally breeded in many cases like animals and denied information, denied, you know, a lot of the intellectual development that existed in the Western part of the world. And to this day, you know, have grown tremendously, and it's something to be tremendously proud of, which I am. But at the same time, you have to have a empathy for the frustration of the lack of understanding of self. Right. And so I think what you see with the Hebrew Israelites is a tremendous lack of understanding of self. So the Jews for sure have an understanding of self. They're not going out yelling at the Protestants. They're not going out yelling at, Arab Muslims. They're going after the Jew. Right. So there's a jealousy there. I think that's the point that I'm getting to.
So we're going to have to go to a break. So stay with us, everybody. We're going to be back after a short break here on the Science of Kabbalah.
Shalom, everybody. Making a difference often takes just one moment and one person at a time. I am Orly Benny Davis, your show host on Israel News Talk Radios from Jerusalem with love. You'll be hearing people talking about politics, religion, social issues, and making a better tomorrow. Join me, Orly Benny Davis, for God and Country. From Jerusalem with love.
Wednesdays on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back once again to Israel News Talk Radio. Visiting with a new friend, Mordechai ben Avraham, awesome author, and having a great show so far. So if you missed it, you need to go back and hit the rewind. So interesting conversation. I appreciate you taking the moment to tell me more about the Black Hebrew Israelite thing. That what you said was very, very, very intuitive, and I really appreciate that. So, Rav, I think you had something you were going to go with on this.
I also found it very interesting in that segment, but William, that we always run out of time because there's always so many things that we want to bring up. So I want to get into a little bit more of the story, because we talked about your background, we talked about growing up in Calabasas, and things really not focusing on religion. So maybe you can get now into the meat of things. You traveled, you came back. What started this journey towards Judaism?
This is going to be the best segment part. I'm just going to say ahead of time, because I haven't really talked about this part as much as I wish I have in other interviews. But the thing is like this. So I'm working in LA doing business and working with different businesses, and I go to this business conference and I meet this girl with this big red hair, and she just totally blows me away. And we go out and we have drinks after the business conference, and she says to me, in the middle of this, like while we're having cocktails, she said, "You're probably wondering why I'm wearing this red string." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." And so she starts to tell me how she goes to this thing called the Kabbalah Center.
Okay.
And so I'm like, "Oh, okay." Yeah, exactly. I'm all, okay, Kabbalah Center. I just read an article about Madonna and this Kabbalah Center thing, because I'm always looking at press releases, working in like the advertisement side of the space. I'm always looking for new products. So there's a press release with Madonna and Kabbalah Center. So I was like, so she's telling me about it, and I'm like, I would love to go, but I was just like wanting to go to hang out with her type of a thing.
Right.
And so she takes me to this Kabbalah Center, and I go there and I go to one of these like intro lectures, and I'm sitting there and I'm just like, oh my God, like this is like, I've been waiting for this information my whole life, this whole thing, because even though my parents were very spiritual and just very good people, like just naturally good people, just very, as we say in Hebrew, very chesed-driven people. They just were always doing things for other people, always giving, sharing. And so we just grew up with a very good moral system. They believed in like therapy and working on yourself and these types of things. So that was more, I would say in a way, a lot more of the religion that we grew up with was really based around working on yourself. But there wasn't anything that ever connected all these things together for me. It was nothing that connected my relationship with God, working on yourself, doing great works into the world, sharing. And so when I went to the Kabbalah Center, that was the first time that all those three things came together. And me and that girl never had any type of relationship. She literally was there for a short amount of time and totally disappeared. I never saw her again. But I ended up staying there for another almost 10 years.
Wow.
And not just me, my whole family came. Like, and my mom actually, who was a professor at UCLA at the time, now she's at USC, actually started to work at the Kabbalah Center and worked in their education department thing. And this was when the Rav Berg was alive, and gotcha. Blessed memory, all these different types of things. So that really shaped my 20s. Gotcha. I was just there, and it shaped my whole thing. And eventually I left in around like 2009, 2010, and I went on a path to do Orthodox conversion. And just to backtrack a little bit, what really was the thing that really took my neshama basically was when I came to Israel in 2004. And I came with the Kabbalah Center. I came with Madonna, and it was like a whole press party, the whole thing. And we came here for Rosh Hashanah. So in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we went to all the Kever Siddiqim. And so, I mean, not all, a lot. In the first mikveh I ever did in my life when I was a non-Jew was with the Arizal in Sfas, right?
Gotcha.
And so, like, all these experiences, going to Rabbi Shimon's kever and all these different things, just literally, my whole internal self was just exploding. But even then, when I came to Israel, I was like, whoa, like, this is energy. I'm coming from LA, this is like, there's no energy there, you know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of pleasure, but there's no real energy there. And I just felt it to a way I never felt it before. And so after I went to Israel, I was like, you know what? If Israel is like this, I remember reading a book about ley lines. I don't know if you heard about ley lines.
Yes.
So like these energy lines, it's a whole thing. I don't want to go into it now, but it was about different places in the world have these tremendous amount of energy there, and spiritualists have used it as tools to connect to God. So what did I do next? The next year, I went to Saudi Arabia and I went to Hajj. And I spent a month in Mecca, and I spent another few weeks in Medina. And I stayed there because I was like, I didn't understand why I was so compelled in Jerusalem. I just wanted to make it into like a spiritual type of a thing that I could achieve anywhere, right? So I went to Mecca, I spent there, I met with people, because now I'm really starting to ask questions, because Kabbalah, at least at that stage, okay, now I understand things much different today,
right.
okay?
I understand.
But at that stage, coming off the streets and not having anything, really, it was like Kabbalah brought in all these questions that made me question everything that I was taught growing up. Like, because Kabbalah brings in a whole frame of energy and how this energy connects to Hashem, how this energy connection to Hashem connects to our neshama, and then the whole matrix of the Hebrew calendar, the whole matrix of the Siddur, the whole matrix of the Tefillah, and why we do the Tefillah. All these different things all literally are symmetrically connected to allow a human soul to connect to this unseen reality, right? And so when I saw that, then I started to challenge everything that I learned in Sufism and Islam. Like, how does this connect? How does this calendar connect? How does this prayer system connect? How does this prayer book called the Quran, how does it connect? Then I went into the history of the Islamic history and how these things were kind of like, they didn't connect, even intellectually for me, you know what I mean? And so from that place, when I came back from the Middle East, and I even went to Egypt after that, I spent almost another month in Egypt and Cairo, and I traveled around and met with different people because I had conversations, I had questions. And then I came back and I just went back to the Kabbalah Center and I stayed there for another probably like 5 years. And then eventually I left and did an Orthodox conversion. It took me 2 years. And I finished my conversion in 2013, 15th of Elul. And after that, I stayed in America for like probably 2.5 years. And then one of the rabbis came to me, because I didn't even know what I wanted to do with myself after I converted. Like, I got involved in politics, which I said, I don't want to talk about politics, but I got involved in politics just because I was just so scared of promoting ideas that were treif, that weren't good, like being in the entertainment business. I just was terrified. So I just wanted to be in an environment where I could communicate and promote ideas that I believed in. And so I said, hey, I'm going to create my own political platform. And I ran for U.S. Congress. And then after that was over, one of the rabbis in my community came to me and said, hey, what do you think about going to Israel to go to yeshiva for a little while? And at this time, I was dating this girl, and I broke up with her. And I was like, I really need to get married. And I was like, yeah, Israel sounds great. And so the rabbis in my community went to Or Sameach. And Or Sameach is a very like Litvish type of yeshiva, and there's a great history. Rabbi Schiller is Rosh Yeshiva there. But I went there, and it was everything that I was really looking for my entire life. It was the information, the insights of how to learn, how to be an independent Jew, how not to be dependent on anybody but Hakadosh Baruch Hu, like just the whole thing. So I stayed in yeshiva. I was only planning on coming for like literally like maybe 6 months, from Elul Zaman to Pesach, and I ended up staying for another 4.5, almost 5 years.
Wow. Yeah, I actually spoke at Or Sameach some years ago. It's a great place. So I mean, this is really very interesting because we sort of had a conversation off the air before we came on about the Kabbalah Center. You should know that probably one of the first shows that William and I ever did when we started this new show, Science of Kabbalah, the title of that show was "This is not Madonna's Kabbalah." So that's interesting. We only have a couple of minutes in this segment, so maybe you can really briefly talk about that, because you spent so much time at the Kabbalah Center and now you spend time in yeshiva and Israel. And so has your perspective changed on how you view the Kabbalah compared to your early days in it?
Well, the thing is like, there's a Rav Berg, right, in blessed memory, who was a student of Rav Brandwein, and Rav Brandwein was a student of Rav Ashlag. And so Rav Yehuda Ashlag had a certain philosophy about Kabbalah and how to bring Kabbalah to the world. And the Rav Berg, who was, the founder of the Kabbalah Center, like he was kind of like just an extension of that philosophy in a way. So a lot of the criticism that he took had a lot to do with him just perpetuating the teachings of, this line of Kabbalists that were considered radical, that were, different things like this. So that's one point. Second point is the concepts that they were teaching, in essence, like in retrospects. I hear echo. I don't know if this is me. But what they were teaching in retrospect was really 7 B'nai Noach concepts with Kabbalistic ideas attached to them. They weren't teaching people how to become Jewish. They weren't teaching people, about, and if they were doing that, I don't think I would have connected so much at that stage of my life. What they were talking about was a transformational system with God and seeing universal tools like Shabbat, not keeping Shabbat, but Shabbat and things like Pesach and other things, like these different ways, and transforming yourself and sharing and giving, which a person who knows about Kabbalah and knows about the meditations and know about the depth of the Zohar and all the Kabbalists that have come throughout history will look at that and be like, that's not Kabbalah, that's not Kabbalah. But but a lot of those base concepts that influenced me early on in life are the very concepts that make me a little bit more, in some way, for lack of a better term, a little bit more advanced than a guy who just studies Gemara.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Gotcha. So we're going to have to go to a break, so hold that thought. We're going to talk a little bit more about that and where you're going now and what you're doing when we come back after these short breaks. Stay with us here on the Science of Kabbalah on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
This is Shai Bentako, and each week I'll be webcasting to you from Judea, origin of the word Jew, a people besieged and beleaguered in every generation. Nazi Germany's but a memory, but in its place the world invented the phantom Palestinians as this generation's internationally authorized Jew killers. Tune in for a different slant on life in Israel, Phantom Nation, every Monday.
Hi, I'm Rabbi David Aaron. The soul basics are the most profound, the most essential, and yet often the most neglected in our education. Join me for Soul Talk on Israel's News Talk Radio and discover the secrets to love, spiritual growth, and personal power.
Welcome back to Science of Kabbalah with Rabbi Yitzhak Michelson and William Hall here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Science of Kabbalah. As usual, things have gone really quickly today. We're in our last segment here with Mordechai ben Avraham, and it's been really a very exciting show today. So I just wanted to clarify, we were talking about the Bala Sulam, Rav Ashlag, and his teachings. And we've mentioned this on the show before. I want to make sure that people understand that I'm certainly never against the teachings of Rav Ashlag. He brought incredible wisdom and incredible light to the Kabbalah and really affected a good segment of the Jewish population in his willingness to teach the Kabbalah and to teach Zohar to the world and not just keeping it, within the framework of Judaism. What we always clarify here on the show is that Rav Ashlag was very clear in separating what he called Ta'amei Torah, the tastes of Torah, from what he would call Sitrei Torah, the idea of the secrets of the Torah, meaning that there are certain things that we can teach the world, but we have to be careful about really going into things like what we call Maaseh Breshit, Maaseh Merkavah, the idea of the workings of creation and the workings of the chariot. So I just wanted to clarify that. But Mordechai, now we've heard your story, Judaism. Here you are in the land, but you have this new project that you're coming out with. So maybe you talk a little bit about that. Tell us about this project, about this new book that's getting ready to come out, why you decided to do it and write it. And we want to save some time at the end for you to share whatever information, if people want to get in touch with you, how they would do that.
So the motivating factor is the more, you learn Torah. I spent, almost the last 5 years of my life just in depth, full time, not doing anything else, day and night learning at different institutions with tremendous Rabbanim. And the more you learn, the more your heart opens. And the more your heart opens, the more you empathize with the pain that other people are feeling in the world. And so from experience, from having a more enlightened heart and a more sensitive heart, I wanted to take a lot of the information that I've learned throughout my life and the Torah information I've learned throughout my life and the development stages of that, and to be able just to share it, because I'm not some super high scholar. I'm not some big rabbi. I'm not a Kabbalah. I'm not any of these. I'm a simple person, that has been blessed with a lot of information. And so I think that perspective is needed in the world. And so the book that I wrote, Mind of the Black Jew, was, really going into, I've given a lot of, speeches and lectures about different topics, Musar and Hashkafa, but the root of it is my story, right? And what I come to realize is that people aren't necessarily fully interested on the step-by-step, okay, I went here, I went there, whatever. People want to know what was going on with your mind that made you want to leave everything that you've ever known behind and keep the Torah, to leave your in a lot of ways, your family, your identity, your community, everything, a real life lech lecha, right? And what made you do that? And that's what the book is about, is going through the thought process and the information and the thought process that allowed me to see that there's more to reality than the 1%. I described in the book, I said there's a 1% reality, which is basically your five senses. And those five senses, the root of that five senses is to connect you to pleasure. But then there's another reality beyond that, which is, we're talking about the 99% reality, which is energy. In Hebrew we call it shefa or kedusha, ruchnius. We have different terms for it. Science refers to it as, they have a term called string theory that talks about these vibrational waves around us. And so the idea is to say that learning that the 1% reality would never suffice me, and only the connection to the 99% that elevates the 1%. But only through that connection of both of those realities can I really obtain what God has in store for all of humanity. And I wanted to express that and not just give it in a conceptual format. I went in and I went through sources, throughout. There was other Rabbanim that were also involved with the putting together this book, and I have Hashkamas from, really, some of the biggest poskim in Jerusalem. So this is a very classic Musar Haskafa Sefer, but it's really rooted in what we call a lot of Kabbalistic thought, but it's not whimsical. It's not in the fairy tale world. It's very lumdish, and you can get what's going on and apply it in real life.
Right. So really what you're talking about is the duality that exists between the physical and the spiritual on a basic level, is what we're saying, is that we have a physical world and we have a spiritual world, and the physicality would be that 1%, the physical world, and then the 99% would be that world that you mentioned about, the ruchniut, the idea of shefa, which some translate as bounty or flow, when we're talking about the upper light of the Ein Sof being filtered down through the Eitz Chaim, through the Sfirot, down to our level of Malchut in the world of Asiyah, the world of doing, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Right, and you mentioned an author earlier, I think in between break, Aryeh Kaplan,
Mm-hmm.
and he wrote a book called Hasidic Masters.
Right.
And he goes through the whole history from the Baal Shem Tov all the way to Rabbi Horowitz, like all the different Hasidic masters that come through. But he brings a mimer from the Alter Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe, I'm just going to take one point. He talks about this idea. He says, how do we understand Hashem's light force from this upper world coming into this world? He says, all we have to do is look at how the same way that clouds bring water, right? The same way that the cloud brings water is the same way, they bring rain. The same way that rain emanates from the cloud is the same way that Hashem's light emanates into this world. And so like things like, we just had Pesach. Pesach is a huge opening in the cosmos, almost like the curtains, over screen opens and this light comes in and we can receive this and literally leave an intellectual, physical state and go into a new reality,
Mm-hmm.
And the Jews express that in Exodus. Anyway, so that's the idea. Or for example, Shabbat, why do we not do work on Shabbat? Because Shabbat is the holiday for the soul. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
Every week we have a way to replenish our soul. So these ideas is what I wanted to share, and I wanted to, put it in the context of Mind of the Black Jew, because I felt like that title it's the mind of the religious Jew. I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, every religious Jew, anything that I'm saying right now, they're gonna be like, yeah, it goes without being said almost, But putting in the context of Mind of the Black Jew, because I felt like the African American experience, this type of imagination and this type of conceptualization of God has never even been introduced. And I think regardless of a person doesn't need to become Jewish. I don't believe people need to become Jewish, but I think people, whether they're Christian or Messianic or Muslim or whatever their background is, taking in the wisdom from the Torah and the wisdom from the rabbis and the wisdom from the sages and applying that to their life will increase their quality of life tremendously and will allow them to understand the Jewish people and understand why we've been persecuted, because there's a force that does not want this information shared in the world, and why there's anti-Semitism in the world, which is a whole nother conversation, because this is the light that the Jewish people are bringing into the world and have been since Har Sinai. And so I'm on that mission. I have a documentary that's not even about me. It's like literally taking the ideas in the book and using animation and voiceovers and different conversations to explain this kind of like spiritual thing, because I believe pain, suffering, and chaos can be removed in the world when we expand the imagination of what life is and with who we are as individuals.
Then no
For
question.
all people, all of humanity.
No question at all. As a matter of fact, I think we were mentioning in between on the break the idea that I said that everyone, every neshama, every soul is said to be chelek Elokei Mima'al, that everything is a part of the Hashem. Every neshama, we've talked about this on the show, was originated metachat kisei hakavod, below the throne of glory. So I'm very excited to know that there's somebody else out there. I'm sure there are plenty of us, but somebody else out there that believes that as passionately as we do on this show about the idea of using this wisdom that was not meant for our people alone, but was meant to transform the world. We have a couple of minutes left. I want to give you an opportunity to share any kind of contact information if people wanted to get in touch with you. They want to find out more information about the book, and maybe you can tell us what that process is. Is it going to be out soon? When you're expecting it? And how people would be able to get that?
So people, the best way to contact me is through like social media. Just go look up Mordechai Yosef ben Avraham. And if you Google it, there's tons of articles and lectures and weekly Parsha shares, all these types of things I have online. But the main way to contact me is just through social media. And the book, right now, I'm with a publisher called Koren Publisher. Maybe Feldheim could be argument. I don't know. The book is completed, Baruch Hashem, and we're scheduled to release it, like maybe, God willing, like close to Rosh Hashanah. But chose to go with a big publisher, knowing the release, a whole process. But I'm very thankful to be working with such a big publisher. It's going to give me a very big scope. Yeah, so just social media, and I would just say that the main thing is self-transformation. That's the thing. And I think if someone asked what's the meaning of life, this is just what I've learned, to come into the world one way and to leave another. And I think hanging on to that concept, a lot of the things I'm promoting and these ideas and really what we have the opportunity to do, your show, myself, everyone involved, we literally have this opportunity to bring a new imagination to humanity that supersedes government, that supersedes race, that supersedes even the concept of famine and poverty. Like, who says who's poor? Who decides that? You know what I mean? So just like a new imagination for human society is really what I'm promoting, and I'm really inspired by.
Awesome. And the name of it again is the book?
Yeah, Mind of the Black Jew.
Okay. Well, it's been an amazing show. I want to thank you so much. Everything sounds very exciting. And, of course, we're going to have you back again, maybe close to when the book is actually out. I want to thank you, William, as always, and I want to thank my new friend, Mordechai ben Avraham, for being with us here on the Science of Kabbalah. Stick with us every week here on Tuesday afternoon, 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on the Science of Kabbalah and IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. Just click the orange button at the top of the IsraelNewsTalkRadio.home page, log in as yourself or an anonymous guest, and join in on the fun. You'll meet other listeners from all over the world who listen to Israel News Talk Radio, and you can make new friends. Israel News Talk Radio's chat room. It's the closest you can get to being in the studio with us.
We love listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Where can you get the inside news on Israel? At Israel News Talk Radio, we're dedicated to sharing Israel's inside story with the world by providing our listeners with news on Israeli politics, current affairs, and Israeli Jewish culture. The Israel News Talk Radio homepage also provides you, the listener, with useful information at your fingertips, with scrolling news headlines, weather, currency exchange, Shabbat candlelighting times, and so much more. Our radio programming is always accessible and on demand. We operate absolutely free of charge for everyone, everywhere. If you love what we do, partner with us now by becoming an Israel News Talk Radio supporter. With your support, you'll be inscribed on our Israel News Talk Radio Wall of Fame. There's nothing like us in the world. Be part of something great. Israel News Talk Radio. Straight talk from Israel.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.